Houston tickets are gone. Yeah, but they're gonna do something pretty cool. They're gonna go ahead and she's been thinking, and so she's going to have a celebration of her life, you know, on that day instead of her birthday party. So, you know, yeah, yeah. Isn't it gorgeous day today? Our campus is so pretty. It was just one.
Hi, how you doing?
I kind of wanted to take
No, I
home
went
some
in.
very well.
Yeah, it's there. I just got one.
Well, you felt like I don't know what happened.
I always noticed that it's a sunset. We're gonna try it. She told me this was last year was last year.
That's probably just as well.
And then 25th wedding anniversary, he's just sitting on it. He's got full beard. She's. They put their hair down inside. The old Druids do it. As far as I can possibly say, it's her 25th. Because I don't think she was like that when she was young. And he died in less than 1908. And my father's he was born in 1909.
Pretty good, well, we do.
That's the one.
Yeah.
I think it was 1908 he died.
Oh.
You know where she was from?
They'd like to do him this, like, tries to do blood runs.
Okay, it looks like we are pretty much all present on site, which is a good thing. This, of course, is the last class, which I must say that I do regret. I mean, that's one of the primary reasons I regret it is that it's a reason why I can go out and study these sorts of things and learn all sorts of things about them. And all my homework has been on leave for the duration pretty much, and the wife comes home tonight. So, that means tomorrow you will find me putting together the lawnmower, and on Saturday I'm going to put in a window. That's going to be different.
I think most of us will attend another class if you give one.
Well, I very much appreciate that, and I'm glad you did that. I should have paid you for that because I just talked to Joe and asked if I could be put on the list for Custer on the Plains in the summer. The summer is because it's been a few years since I did either one of these classes, and it's another perfect segue right into what's going on with all of that. I don't know how many people here do their studies on the computer or live in the internet world on the computer. But the results of living on the internet world is, which I've been on since 1995. Okay, I got on the internet in '95 when it was quite different. Now, where's that lead related to this? Where it leads related to this was you're perpetually surprised by this stuff, right? One of the problems for us is that we're perpetually surprised. Things aren't where we put them. Now, this situation that I just had here is an example of they weren't where I put them. And by the time you learn it, chances are it's changed. Okay, that's fine. Back to where we're going with the study of history. With the study of history, what's happened in the intervening 5 years, that there's been one of the fundamental things about the web is it's very, very difficult to look at a conversation that involves everybody speaking English interested in Custer on the web. You want to make a domain, an area of all the people that might contribute to my class, that's them. Well, let's do it time-wise as well. everybody that ever wrote in English that got scanned and put on the internet in the last God knows how long, excuse me, 100 years, is out there, mostly. 20 years ago, that wouldn't have been at all the same. If I'd done the study 20 years ago, it would have been a very, very slow, ponderous, a very ridiculously, I couldn't do it now hardly, it'd drive me crazy. Because what I've got now is that I've got access to thousands, millions probably, of things that I just didn't have. So now the whole approach is different than when I did history in college. In college, I'd get the book, read the book, write some notes. And I had a stack of books in college like this. My college history experience is like this, right? And being a country school boy and I kind of a compulsive sort, I tried to read them all. Wrong approach, but I did. Okay? And the result of that was that was my domain then, and I didn't get it all done. Well, with this magic box here, in about 5 minutes, I can give you a pretty good slide that'll talk about any simple program you want to talk about, from stem cells to General Pierce. It'll be that fast. Now, sometimes it isn't, but where we go back to the 5-year part of it is that this thing changes by the day. When I did this stuff 5 years ago, there wasn't near the video out there. And a lot of this stuff parks itself at YouTube. So if you got a smart TV at home, you get YouTube on your smart TV. Go out there and look at the stuff on the Civil War. The Park Service has done all sorts of presentations very much like this one. And they're a pretty good benchmark for a guy like me. And then there's people that are really the Hollywood professionals. And they're amazing. There's a movie out there called The Wicked Spring. The whole movie isn't necessarily interesting, but they have a picture in there for 11 minutes of the Battle of the Wilderness that I think pulls it off pretty good. It's not the real thing, because the truth of it is, if we really got to see the real thing by the hour, day in, day out, us kids too, we'd be suffering from battle fatigue. Probably, my bet. You only take so much reality, and reality in the wilderness was horrendous. It probably was beyond comprehension for most people, and some people actually enjoyed it. Isn't that strange? There were people who enjoyed combat. Back in college, I heard about this guy that said the most fun he ever had in his life was his 3 days at Gettysburg. That's a strange duck. Custer was a strange duck in lots of ways, and because of his physicalness. Custer could be up like 2-3 days. Custer could get on a horse and ride for 2-3 days at a time. You don't really want to serve under Custer, because he can do things you can't do even if you're 22. So that's a kind of a problem. Anyway, there's an immense amount of stuff that's appeared in the last 5 years. And like I tell over at the museum, it may appear again tomorrow. We may have more tomorrow. There's beautiful, wonderful stuff available for free out there about almost anything, but certainly about history of the Civil War. Before I get off on that too much, because we have, of course, our evaluations today, and that is always a day that cuts me short, because we do that at the end of class. And let's see, we're going to skip all this important information, because everybody knows what breaks and bathrooms and classrooms and stuff are, and that still doesn't work that way, and all that stuff we know. We did this talking about up the Shenandoah Valley campaign last week. We got up to here and even went on through some of this a little bit. And we had the overland campaign we reviewed a little, and so on. Yes, sir.
Why do you overlook the Peninsula campaign that started the war?
Well, I did.
I
didn't. That was in the very first class, and the way I looked at these things, it was difficult for me not to go back to that when I found really great stuff on the Peninsula campaign. You remember from the first situation, we're talking about Custer, the lieutenant, and Custer, the captain. Custer was in the Peninsula campaign, but he was working on staff for McClellan, for Kearney, for others. He also was a balloon observer in the Peninsula campaign. There are holes in this, okay? The holes, the big hole that I feel that I didn't really cover what Custer was up to is say, what's Custer up to around Appomattox? Well, I can gloss that over to you and talk about the fact that what he was a staff officer somewhere from McClellan. You gave me a perfect entry into one thing I want to mention that's weird about my man Custer. Maybe not, because we are all inconsistent, aren't we? We all are like this, like this, like this, like this, until no, we're not like this. Custer was a caring person. Sounds strange? Certainly not what the 70s said about it. If you were, when Custer's friend, Ron Sur, who was opposite him at Cedar Creek, which we'll talk about today, was dying as a result of the action at Cedar Creek, which Custer was on the other side of. It's Custer and his friends that are in there basically tending the bedside. Now the Marines on Guadalcanal didn't tend the bedside. It'd be a 30-06 bullet right between the eyes. That's how they tended the bedside. Those two extremes should be understood. And it was fair game both ways, believe me. But if you don't understand that crucial difference between the Civil War and, say, Dad's war in the Pacific, you better. Because they had no prisoners. There were no prisoners at Guadalcanal. Maybe 5. And all of us that are Vietnam age have heard in our sophisticated situation to go to this century, not this one, the last one. Go to the last century. Most of us back in our sophistication or our service are aware of that idea of take these 5 prisoners, go to the rear and be back in 5 minutes. Right? You know what it means. Well, that happened in the Civil War too. That particularly happened to black soldiers in the Civil War. I mean, if you're captured in the Civil War, you ain't going to Andersonville. You aren't going much further than the next rise. Because there were orders out in some places, if you catch a black man under arms, you're going to shoot him right now. And not to mention this little fact, these guys, this was a total war, which means it's the war of everybody against everybody. Which means you're all on one side, you're all on the other side, but if you meet in the middle of a parking lot somewhere, the war may go on. Kind of like the Hatfields and the McCoys. The result of that is that in the Civil War that was different. Back to Custer, Custer took care of that friend. Custer, if a person was injured, Custer might give them money to send them home. Did that kind of thing. In the meantime, he really liked McClellan. That's strange, because Custer was a man of action. If Custer saw you over there, he's going to hit you in a minute. It won't be a minute. Who's he like? Jeb Stuart. Jeb Stuart and Custer would have been the A-team. Absolutely the cavalry A-team. Stuart would leap before he looked every time. Custer did the same, not because they were careless or maybe even extended themselves like I'm talking about, but because that's how they won. I heard one time a thing that was valuable to me once driving. Fighter pilots in World War II learned the hard way that if somebody's on your tail, you turn and then you look. Now one time on I-75 down in Detroit in the morning, I had that situation. I turned before I looked, because if I didn't turn before I looked, I was going to take this guy right out in front of me, because I was coming down on him and he decided to pull up in front of me. So there was a gap there and I was okay. If there wasn't, it surely would have been my fault. But the P-38 pilots taught me that one, which says there's a time when if you look, that'll be the last look you'll do. So you better turn and look later. That's what happened in World War II. In the cavalry back in the Civil War, same thing happened really quickly. Custer was great at it. So was Jeb Stuart. Jeb Stuart died. Custer died. But both of them are studied in classes like this. And lots of conservative guys are just home. So So in terms of serving their country and their cause, they were great men. They also were showmen. Jeff Stewart had a plume in his hat, looked like a cavalier, thought like a cavalier to a degree. Custer, similar. Both of them were show people, but they showed for a very strong reason. Okay, let's go this. I'll have my hard time with all of this. I can just see it coming. Okay. Yep. Overland campaign changed the character of warfare. Strategic maneuver to trench. Okay, here's the thing that we know the answer on the test, I think. The answer on the test about total war is that Grant and Sherman got together and they dreamed up this idea that we're going to push the Confederates every day, all the time. Grant and Sherman did this. That's a good answer on the test. But like everything that's the answer on the test, it's probably a lot near, not three-dimensional, not real world. The whole idea in the North was that once Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, this changes everything. Because the Emancipation Proclamation means the South society will not ever be the same again in huge ways. And by the way, all the rich people who really did start this war in the South, they did. They're losing most of the value of what made the South the fifth richest nation on earth. So all those big houses we love to look at, they're a lot like the castles over in England, very lot like it. The economic system that they had around them was very much like it. Their economic system was not at all like the North, or even like ours, which was similar to the North in a way. They, personally, are going to be made destitute. In both the North and the South, you have huge race relation problems beyond even comprehension, right? Which means that you're taught that those blacks are meant to be hewers of wood and carriers of water, right? Ever get that in Sunday school? I did. It's true, it's out there, by the way. And it was taught that way in the North in the 50s, and it's a 19 in front of them. What do you think it was taught like in the 1850s? Oh, I'm glad that's yours. I thought it was mine. I can live with that sort of thing. This little thought is very important because it's another idea that I want to get across in this class that's come to me as I spoke. Still don't know hardly anything, but I know a little more than I did. One is that when Lee signed the surrender, the real point of the total war wasn't over. The shooting was kind of over, and the country came back together, and we agreed we were going to do that more or less. But what wasn't over, and what still isn't over, is the idea that slavery, the death of slavery does not mean equality by a long sight, if you listen like the lawyers do. And it didn't mean equality. It probably doesn't mean equality yet. But it certainly didn't mean equality up until all of us in this room were adults. It was the 60s at least before it meant equality, okay? So, where that leads is, Custer had his own personal look at that. What happened to a lot of those northern boys is, they had a feeling about slavery, and it was kind of like, don't bother it and it won't bother you. And these abolitionists are busy making us a war that we don't care about much, and now we've got to put this country back together. That's where it was. And then what happened to Custer was, Custer goes south. Custer starts to look at the stripes on the back of these people, and Custer, being kind of a kind person in a way, was thoroughly convinced, number one, that the South was primitive, and was thoroughly convinced that institution. So all of these things are going on for him. But The point of that is, in the next class, I will have to deal with Reconstruction, where I'll bet you everybody in this room would tell me something that I suspect we were subjected to, and that our children get subjected to in different ways all the time. In the 1950s, when I'm doing this, and the early 60s in public school, Reconstruction was kind of a chapter in the history book that said, right after the Civil War, blacks and scallywags and carpetbaggers took over the law, the government in the South, and there'd usually be a cartoon. This is a cartoon from the era, and they'd have somebody up there who looks a whole lot like somebody that should be in a zoo. And they'd be talking a language that was extremely uneducated, and that was what resulted. And what we just were subjected to was a whole bit of probable propaganda. Now, if you go out to American Experience or somebody, thanks to the Magic Box, you're going to find things on Reconstruction. You're going to get a different view of that, maybe. So these things come down and they affect me. And where they're really like that is, that ain't over. The battle for our textbooks goes on all the time. But I was surprised that this is one where, deep in my soul, I still believe Reconstruction was a bunch of incompetents handling everything. Maybe, maybe not. But I gotta roll back to this. Some of this was about Custer living through all of that, and in the next class we'll try to deal with it. Overland campaign. This would be great if this works. We don't see. Looks like it might be trying. If I have to get back to it again. My first time going directly out to YouTube on the web.
1864. The Civil War enters its fourth year. Although Union armies had made significant inroads in Tennessee and the Mississippi Valley, battle lines remained relatively unchanged in Virginia. At last, Lincoln finds a general who will fight. Ulysses S. Grant is appointed commander of all Union armies. He determines upon a simple but novel strategy. Advance simultaneously with all his forces on key enemy centers. Grant makes his headquarters with his largest force, the Army of the Potomac, a well-fed, well-supplied, and well-rested army that was ready for...
Stop that. And that's an example of technology hard at work, that would work. So what I'll recommend to you is this is, possibly we could get these guys down here and see if that could work. Yes, this is Fred Welsh's room 129 here at Curtis Hall, and I'm trying to play a video, and we got a surprise here. Okay. That's worth actually seeing if I can get to it. From the current slide. I don't want to be in that current slide. We'll go back to this one. When you do this sort of thing, you really have to be flexible. What that movie does, I can talk about the movie in advance, and the movie is a perfect example of a thing that's new to me. Those of us who study Civil War history are subjected to helpful things and less helpful things. Helpful things. Give me a map that shows where these things are. Not terrible. Huh? Super. Here's our problem. Naturally, everything that can go wrong will. And you get to operate, watch a tech guy just perform under pressure. Okay? Back up, back up, back up. Background, all I had was slide one. That's it. Now you will watch, you see what we're doing from here, from the slide. I have been doing this for 50 years, and so all right, we gotta go up here and do slideshow. Zoom slideshow. Okay. Yeah, I think that's interesting. Let's go back up here and see if we can find it, whatever slideshow is. Well, that is interesting. Yeah. Right there. Oh, I could bring that up. I brought that up and it opened, so that is okay. So it's not getting out, it's not getting open for there. And you gotta hit those links, when you're in the slideshow, is what I found. So we may have a little problem getting that. Try.
Was there audio? There's supposed to be audio.
Yes.
There it is.
Back.
New back, ability to escape. Go back to the slide. The video?
1864. The Civil War enters its fourth year. Although Union armies have made significant inroads in Tennessee and the Mississippi Valley, battle lines remain relatively unchanged in Virginia. At last, Lincoln finds a general who will fight. Ulysses S. Grant is appointed commander of all Union armies. He determines upon a simple but novel strategy. He advanced simultaneously with all his forces on key enemy centers. Grant makes his headquarters with his largest force, the Army of the Potomac, a well-fed, well-supplied, and well-rested army that was ready for the coming ordeal. Confederate General Robert E. Lee understood the realities. His army of Northern Virginia is outnumbered nearly 2 to 1. Supplies are scarce. Obliged to conserve resources, he must fight a defensive war. With luck, his undaunted army will hold back Yankee invaders until fall presidential elections could potentially change the political landscape. The Union Army breaks camp on the evening of May 3rd. The men on both sides have little concept of the horror that lies ahead. The fighting in the coming weeks will kill and wound more of them than at any other time in American history. Grant will operate against Lee's right flank, using coastal waterways to establish and supply his army as it moves. But to carry out this plan, Grant has to advance into the fabled wilderness. A 70-square-mile tract of dense woods and thickets, poorly mapped, with few roads. Its thickets will neutralize Union superiority in numbers and this to happen. He sees that Grant's right is vulnerable and moves with Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps on Orange Turnpike and A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps on the Plank Road. James Longstreet's Corps recently arrived from East Tennessee, has greater distance to cover. Morning, May 5th. Armies collide on both thoroughfares as the struggle develops into 2 distinct battles, separated by trackless wilderness. Governor Warren's 5th and John Sedgwick's 6th Corps go into position on the right, centered about a clearing called Saunders Field, while Hancock's 2nd Corps occupies the strategic Broad Road intersection. Bitter but inconclusive fighting rages until dark. Grant prepares to deliver a decisive blow come morning. Meanwhile, the Confederates, exhausted and disorganized, anxiously await Longstreet's arrival. The Union attack begins at 5 a.m. Warren and Sedgwick are quickly contained on the turnpike. Hancock crushes a ragged Confederate line on Plank Road, and the day appears lost for Lee. Longstreet's arrival turns the tide as his brigades press Hancock back, but Longstreet is badly wounded at a critical moment. His attack loses momentum. Lee pauses and strikes again on the Rock Road. The fighting rages. When determined Union counterattacks drive the rebels back. Later that afternoon, Georgian John B. Gordon launches a vigorous attack on Sedgwick's exposed right flank, capturing many prisoners. But darkness ends the affair before further damage can be done. The fighting causes the dry woods to catch fire. Many wounded men perish in the flames. Both sides fortify their positions. Earthworks and trenches scar the landscape for miles. Stalemate ensues. Soldiers are exhausted. Nearly 30,000 have been killed, wounded, or captured. This 3-day fight in the wilderness is the 4th bloodiest battle of the war up to that time. Both commanders have learned something about each other. Grant discovers Lee's army is more formidable than any opponent he has faced. Open flanks led to embarrassing reversals. Grant will ensure that this does not happen again during this campaign. Lee realizes his opponent is a man of different character. Grant is not retreating as his predecessors had. Instead, Grant pushes southward toward the crucial crossroads at Spotsylvania Courthouse. Union morale skyrockets. Grant is continuing the advance on Richmond. Warren's 5th Corps is leading the advance, slowed by Confederate cavalry. Warren reaches a clearing near Spotsylvania called Laurel Hill. But Lee has won the race to the crossroads. The path ahead is blocked by Joseph B. Kershaw's veteran division. Confederate forces quickly dig in, creating a formidable defensive position. George Meade, Army of the Potomac commander, orders Sedgwick's 6th Corps to support Warren in the attack on the Confederate position at Laurel Hill. It does not go well. Delays and ultimately concentrated rebel fire halts the attack. As the balance of the armies come up, the battle lines extend for miles. Both sides dig in and prepare for the upcoming ordeal. Union cavalry commander Philip Sheridan cuts loose on a raid towards Richmond. Grant hopes this move will force Confederate cavalry hero Jeb Stuart into a showdown battle with Sheridan, the competent Yankee newcomer. 3 days later at Yellow Tavern, Sheridan found found his path blocked by Stewart. A sharp skirmish ensues. Jeb Stewart is mortally wounded and dies the next day. Heavy skirmishing continues throughout May 9th as Union soldiers probe the surrounding wilderness, trying to determine the position of Lee's army. Union General Sedgwick, beloved commander of the 6th Corps, is killed, the victim of a sharpshooter's bullet. Grant has received reinforcements in the form of Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps. He orders Burnside to advance on Spotsylvania along the Fredericksburg Road. This forces Lee to bend back his right flank, creating a vulnerable bulge in his lines, dubbed the Mule Shoe. Meanwhile, Lee entrenches his line and continues to improve it. Confederate artillery is positioned to pour crossfire upon any attacking column. After Sedgwick's death, Horatio Wright assumes command over the 6th Corps. He spies a weak point in the Confederate line and orders Colonel Emory Upton to exploit it. With 12 hand-picked regiments, the carefully planned attack advances in lines 4 regiments deep. It's an innovative idea. Upton's men burst out of trees a mere 200 yards from the rebel works and pour through the lines of the shocked Confederates. In desperate fighting, nearly 1,000 rebels are captured, but the Yankees give no support. Confederate reinforcements force Upton's attackers to retreat, abandoning their dead and wounded. Although a failure, this sort of attack was revolutionary in concept and execution. It will be used again. Heavy skirmishing continues along the line on May 11th, as both Grant and Lee plan their next moves. As his target, Grant selects the Mule Shoe. The attack is scheduled for early the next morning, May 12th. Throughout the day and well into the evening, Union troops move into position. Meanwhile, Lee uncharacteristically misinterprets Grant's intentions. He thinks Grant is about to retreat and removes key artillery pieces from the Mule Shoe. Modeled upon Upton's charge, a massive Union attack, spearheaded by Winfield Scott Hancock's veteran 2nd Corps, rolled over the Confederate line. 5,000 rebels are captured, including 2 generals and numerous cannons. In desperate straits, Lee coordinates a series of counterattacks that drive Union forces back. The entire line was recaptured, except at the angle of the bulge, or Mule Shoe itself, ever after christened the Bloody Angle. Here, a bitter struggle ensues as Union forces desperately cling to their limited gains against repeated Confederate counterattacks. The soldiers fight at point-blank range, with only a few feet between them. The battle rages along a narrow front. After 18 hours of constant combat, the Confederates withdraw to a hastily constructed reserve line. The 2 armies are exhausted after 7 days of intense fighting. Stymied, Grant proposes to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. Over the next week, the battle lines pivot southward, but Grant resolves to break off the action at this point. Spotsylvania would emerge as the 3rd bloodiest battle of the Civil War. In a bold move, Grant quits the field, hoping to turn Lee's right flank again and make for Richmond. Lee, however, knows his intentions and races for the North Anna River, 20 miles to the south. Arriving in a long blocking position on a series of commanding bluffs south of the river. Grant reaches the North Anna on May 23rd and begins crossing that very day. has missed his best opportunity of striking a decisive blow. Lee knows that he must stop Grant before he reaches the Richmond area. If not, Grant will besiege the Confederate capital, and the city's demise would be a mere question of time. Grant cuts loose from the line at North Anna and sweeps southeast, closer to Richmond. The armies are back on familiar turf, ground in McClellan's campaign 2 years previous. The opposing forces clash on a front that stretches several miles along Totopotomoy Creek. By the 1st of June, Grant has pivoted around Richmond, and his soldiers seize the strategic crossroads at Old Cold Harbor. Fighting erupts near sundown, but the results are inconclusive. Grant, sensing an opportunity to crush Lee, orders the attack renewed at dawn. He awaits the arrival of significant reinforcements. William F. Smith's 18th Corps from Butler's Army of the James, operating south of Richmond. But reinforcements require additional time. The attack is postponed 24 hours until June 3rd. It is a fatal delay. Confederates use the time to consolidate and fortify their positions. Now, masters of the art, these veterans erect elaborate earthworks with well-sighted artillery positions, creating deadly crossfires. Dawn, June 3rd. The 2nd, 6th, and 18th Corps assault the Confederate lines on a broad front and are repulsed with staggering losses. Confederate General Evander Law said, "It wasn't war, it was murder." For Grant's part, he wrote, "I always regretted the second attack at Cold Harbor." Once more, the two armies are in stalemate. Grant is unwilling to admit defeat and plans future operations. Meanwhile, conditions on the field are unbearably inhumane. No truce is declared to bury dead or recover wounded lying between opposing forces. Cutting railroads would isolate Richmond from the Deep South. Grant decides to take the war across the James River and strike Richmond from the south via the railroad center at Petersburg. Fooled, Lee fails to see his enemy's intentions, and Grant withdraws from the Cold Harbor line unmolested by Confederates. Union forces are reinvigorated by the mere sight of the James River. The horrors of the wilderness lay far behind. Most cross the wide river on lengthy pontoon bridges, an engineering feat thought to be impossible by many. The Overland Campaign is over. There had never been such a bloodletting upon this continent. From the Rapidan to the James River, the Butcher's Bill was more than 80,000 men killed, wounded, and missing. All in less than 6 weeks. Contrary to popular opinion, both commanding generals displayed both brilliance and poor judgment. Grant fights his way to the gates of Richmond. Lee becomes pinned in the Richmond and Petersburg defenses. The Army of Northern Virginia has been staggered, but not destroyed. Lee, however, is unable to replace those lost, and his army will not recover from the recent ordeals. But his soldiers, man for man, have proven more than a match for Grant. The war enters a new phase in the more open country south of the James River. The fortified lines and breastworks extend for miles around Richmond and Petersburg. Lee's prophecy comes true. Grant crosses the James, besieges Richmond, and 10 months later, forces the demise of the Confederate capital, the Army of Northern Virginia, and ultimately, the Confederacy itself.
And there we go. Now we can switch that back now. nature of our life is to be different. I hope that's better. Guess what, it's still running. We could see the very next video, which might be, Star Wars, I don't know. Might be.
My name is Paul Cannell, and I am the president of the...
There are, as I mentioned though, what's likely to be, is it's likely to be something related to this, because they do PowerPoint, or they do YouTube videos by channel and subscriber. So there are one thing after the other. So when you find one, you often find things that relate to the other situation. Several things about this video that I wanted people to notice. I have never seen a better video on this stuff. Because I could put a group of us together studying this sort of thing for hours and couldn't come up with as clear a presentation as what they've done here. Never seen that. That's what, say like guys that, like us that do things in presentation, our goal should be kind of something like that, because now we've got a new way to display things. Having those blocks move around like the kids do in the war games and represent what's really happening is a whole lot clearer to this human than a bunch of things. The worst of those is like somebody says, Company A moved to the top of the hill. What is it? Who cares? But by the time you get 10 lines of those, you just as well be off having a lunch, because you're not getting anything out of it. This told me a lot, really pretty quickly, and one of them was the quality of the presentation. Other things I like about this video is I like the effect of the mass fire. Reenactors never have enough people. They're the wrong age, and they don't have the intensity. Professionals can get this done. These were reenactors, but they were edited them quite a bit, I think. The point of it is all right, you can see right in front of your eyes, if you want to turn the differences that might exist on YouTube in about 5 minutes. That's the way they did it in the second half of the Civil War. What's different about this compared to what they did, say, at Bull Run? The very first battle of the war, how'd they fight it? Well, I'll tell you how they fought it. They fought it a lot like, as far as I know, until I learn better. And I'm always learning. Those guys march up there in a rank. We get there like they did at Yorktown, or not Yorktown, where they did have ditches, but say like they might do in many, many conflicts in the Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, in the Patriot. They have lots of these, you can see. They stand there 100 yards apart and they fire at each other. And the thing they missed in the test was the rifled musket. Well, by this time, 2 years later, they figured it out. We're not doing this stand there toe-to-toe crap anymore, are we? What are they doing? They got their bayonets, they're digging in. They're digging in as fast as they can go with anything they got. I also read in another thing, they used head logs. The man in that thing that I read 50 years ago said, during the first 2 years of the war, we never used a head log. Well, the head log sits right up here and stops that mini ball from going right through your head. Okay? Very good job, because mini balls are not like the 30-06 that some of you guys know about. I know, because I fired 2 of them. I fired an M1 and I fired a 58 caliber replica within a minute and a half of each other 50 years ago. Friend had both. A mini ball gun, if you got a log this thick, it stops the ball. If you're looking at an M1, you need to have about 6 of those logs. Because that log will keep your head from being sighted on, but it won't do one thing to protect your head. And neither will the helmet you got on, right? The test for the American military since the Spanish-American War is, will this bullet go through both sides of a military helmet at 500 yards? And a 06 will, and a 308 will, and the current shell probably won't. But it's different. Overland campaign, other things. It's novel. You know, you remember they said interesting going across the pontoon bridge, some people thought they couldn't do it. Well, that's one reason why it's good to study history, because I did a paper in college on the Persian War in Greece, where they came into Greece in 479 BC. You know how they came in? 200,000 men came over a pontoon bridge. So this is an example of the writer of this being about 2,000 years behind, which is not too bad, people. okay? Shenandoah. We also talked here about Yellow Tavern, and you've got a break-off point to make it so that I feel that I'm not telling you enough about what Custer's doing here, because Custer's off on the periphery of all of this, and sometimes he's discovering groups that are moving in and so on. He's present in all of these in some capacity. But what we also heard there is that at Spotsylvania, Grant had Sheridan and Sheridan's group, including Custer, break off, and they went down to, way down here, Yellow Tavern, where they quickly got in a confab with Stewart. Well, that resulted in the death of Stewart, and it resulted also in a situation where the cavalries at this point aren't equal in number. Basically, I feel sorry for the Confederates throughout. I feel sorry for the common person almost from the beginning, because they were led down a primrose path, is what they were. There was a way. There will be people who argue the South could win the war. Yes, they could, if the North let them. And if England and France let them. Whether England and France have the moxie right now to stop the North, I don't know. A thing I should know. Because one other thing I should know as a Civil War student is that what was the next war before this fought in Europe that people that were in the Civil War took a good big look at? Anybody got an idea?
Crimea.
Got it. Unless you think that they weren't doing this sort of thing. McClellan was no field general, but he was smarter than sin, and he was the designated hitter to go over to the Crimea, right where we have fun today, with some of the same people, and take a look at how they were doing things. Now, what haven't I done? I don't know the mass of their armies. I don't know the weapons that well. There's things that were happening there. They did have Florence Nightingale over there doing sanitary types things. There's things you could learn about that. When did it change? Well, I'll tell you one thing that changed. That mass of muskets, that forest of muskets coming over the top of that line and going bang all at once, was not anything you see TR doing, all right? TR's charging up the hill, not Teddy Roosevelt. Yeah, there's Teddy Roosevelt. Charging up the hill, San Juan Hill. Joe Wheeler's there, you know, the Confederate Joe Wheeler's fought for the Union again. And so did Fitzhugh Lee, again, joined the American Army and fought in the Spanish-American War in Cuba, I guess. Well, they are busy using Springfields like Custer did on the plains, but most of them are using Craig Jorgensen's. And my friends, the Spanish up here, got one of the best military rifles ever made, the Mauser, which would have done just fine all the way from 1898 to 1945. So it's getting dated to 45. They don't go charging like that all shoulder to shoulder. They just don't. This is the Shenandoah. This is Lee's answer to all of this, okay? Remember, we'd going down here and we'd clear down here. I wish I had another screen. I'm an overland campaign. I'm coming down through here, I'm coming down towards Richmond down here, and Lee is in trouble. He's got to get the pressure off. How does he elect to do it? He selects one corps and 2 cavalry brigades, which equals probably pushing 20,000 men, and sends them under Early, I think, up to the Shenandoah again. Now, one unique thing about the Shenandoah Valley that's obvious to somebody looking at the map. Here is Washington, D.C. Here's the Shenandoah. Boom. It's a perfect channel right dead down the throat of Washington, all through the war, and still today would be. Where does it point going the other way? To beautiful Middle Tennessee. Not much there. That's one of those cases where I can gain a lot, not lose a tremendous amount, except for one thing. See this city of Lynchburg right here? Lynchburg, Virginia, turns up, and after a long time, I finally found out Lynchburg, Virginia was a center of supplies, a center of railroad communication, a very important center. I don't know enough about the railroads in the South, not by half. because this whole thing depends on supply to a large degree. So I've got to know what, Custer doesn't have to know it, but Washington needs to know the whole economic situation in their side of this and the South as well. Well, if I can affect this business here in Lynchburg, what effect does it have? So they want to defend Lynchburg quite a bit. Anyway, Early's out here and he's got 30,000 men. The problem that Lee's got all through this is he's got a really good mind for doing defense work, and he does a good mind with attack. The problem is he just doesn't have the backup. It's over, you know. It's like he's going toe to toe down through the Overland campaign with Grant, and maybe he's winning some, maybe he's losing some, but the point is he can't replace them. He can't replace anything. He can't replace horses, he can't replace weapons, he can't replace people. So, down here, he's making a really tough decision. He sends 1 corps, 2 cavalry regiments over, battalions over here under Early, and that will result in some famous things that happen. Early goes over here and he gets dealing with a man named Hunter, who had replaced a general that was a political general, they called Steele, I think. Hunter gets over here, they mess it up different ways, and I don't want to talk about much, and Hunter gets pushed out of the valley. Hunter decides to go over the mountains into West Virginia because he's going to go up to the Ohio River and kind of float down the river and get back here where he belongs. Lots of this stuff is really simple, especially if you watch football. You got 30,000 guys here and they want to get to Washington. What do you really need? Well, you need a blocker up here. You need a blocker right at the end of that valley. Where's your blocker? Well, it's Mr. Hunter, the general, and he's off over in West Virginia somewhere, and you won't even hear from him for a long time. Because it turns out he can't deal with the river right because the height of the river isn't right. So he doesn't much play anymore, and of course all the players are really not very impressed with him. Because in the meantime what happens is Early comes clear over here and he does really good, and he's right there in that famous thing where Mr. Lincoln stands there in Fort Stevens. He's a big, tall guy with a hat. Everybody recognizes him. It's not a problem. And Verner gets a bullet between his eyes. That's Fort Stevens. I told you something that was absolutely, completely wrong. That happened regularly. And what happens to go here is that, yes, there was huge defenses around Washington, D.C., all sorts of things, but they had heavy artillery guys and guns like this, you know, big Rodman guns. A Rodman gun, you probably see them. Their artillery, they'll reach from probably here to the door, and they'll be as wide as the breech at that. Okay, their cannons are getting serious now. By 30 years after 1863, at the Columbian Exposition, the Germans will have, the Krupp firm will have at Chicago in 1893 a gun they called the Thunderer. The Thunderer, they said at that fair, which was wrong, but they said it and they believed it, if we fire this gun, it will knock all the buildings down. Concussion. Well, Thunderer was not to be trivialized because Thunderer would go 12 miles. And a 12-mile artillery piece with, say, a 100-pound or 200-pound ball is not to be played with. They really were moving fast. Anyway, Stevens is a close thing. And the reason it was a close thing is because everybody's pulling their folks down here. So Lee made a try. But Lee was looking for Custer's luck. And Custer's luck, in Lee's case, didn't work in this situation. There's a battle here called Monassee, and Early's turned back, he comes back into the valley, and things start to happen. Needless to say that the North won't tolerate this. The North's got resources, they stand that valley. Sheridan, who does not get along with Meade at all. That's a piece of, Grant's got two people he really values. He really values Custer, really likes him. But Sheridan, there's an ally there too. Sheridan and Meade, they don't get along at all. It doesn't work. So Meade, for all of his looking like Froggy, and he was called Froggy, was a fellow who had a bad temper on occasion and wasn't that easy to get along with sometimes. And Sheridan had a bad temper too. So they're down there, so Grant's just as happy to see these two guys separated, not to mention the fact he's got this huge problem up here he's got to handle anyway. So he sends that group up there and they conduct the Valley Campaign. And it's one of these things where the two armies aren't equal at all by this point. So there's a huge problem. You don't want this job as your Confederate boy. You don't want it at all. You don't want it as, you don't want it in any capacity, but you sure don't want it as a Confederate, because it's going to turn out really badly in the end. What's going to turn out like you're going to be in prison, you're going to be killed, or you're going to be scattered. Jubal Early's army was destroyed and demolished. That's the end of it, and the result of it was when Jubal Early, clear way beyond all this story, goes back to Petersburg, reports to his boss, Lee just sends him home. Said your job there was so bad nobody would want to serve under you, and so on. So you could look at Early for the rest of his life. You know, he sacrificed a great deal, and that kind of is how his service ended. So it wasn't felt very well, I'm sure. If I was Mr. Early. Okay, Early's in the battle. Washington only had 10,000 men at the time who were in those lines. Washington, they've been supplying troops. Washington would have been effective. Why? The fundamental thing that I don't understand in this thing right now is not military at all. It's the election. The only chance that the South has got remains the same as it has been, which is European involvement, which must have been looking pretty shaky at this point, if you were a student, if you had any sense. So they're not going to buy into this thing, all right? Victoria had a lot more sense than that, so did the French, even though they were already in trouble in Mexico, remember that? One thing about this is Mexico during this time's got Maximilian down there. They got their own revolution going on. Big things going on in Mexico. So France is involved below the Rio Grande. Unlikely the foreigners are going to get involved here. And not only that, but you remember the Crimean War I talked about? Well, it turns out, you see, that France and Britain had this huge problem with Russia. Now, the way that worked out is that it's fine for Britain and France to get involved in some sort of conflict in the United States, except the Tsar over in Russia said 20 years later, if they did, my ships were coming to America. So Russia's involved in that part of what didn't happen in our Civil War, and so is Mr. Custer in a way, because when you do the Custer on the Plains class, you're going to find Custer having a very different life than he's having here. Custer there was on the perfect movie scene again. Custer was part of a dramatic, all expenses paid tour for the Archduke of Russia, Alexis, as he toured the Western Plains and other places with the likes of Buffalo Bill, Custer, and other famous people. And they went around and had a fantastic time, went shooting elk on buffalo and all this sort of thing. Relates back to this, because England's not coming into that war. And if the election puts our man McClellan in, the Copperheads are probably going to win, and the war will be over because they're tired of it, like we did in some of our stuff. That's a chance they got. If they don't have that, they don't have any. So, it really matters what's going on around Washington that makes Lincoln look bad, because he's got to win that election. Because otherwise McClellan will, and McClellan, a mixed bag. Early was also, when he was at Washington, he was supposed to free prisoners. Lynchburg in the Upper Valley, I mentioned that. It was a supply center and a hospital center. More things to learn about. These are the battles he fought, which I am not going to go into too much, because we've already gone over a bunch of them. Interesting thing, on the internet you can find this stuff. Each one of these things in yellow is a link. Click on them and you will get more information. And I put on my machine right here. To find out more and more and more about it. One problem studying all of these things is this horrible tendency in the part of the South and the North to name the battles different. Which can make you look really, really stupid. Especially since you realize when you stand up here, you may very well be in front of a person who spent the last 20 years going to Civil War roundtables and knows a great deal about the Civil War, far more than the average guy who fought it. So this is not, say like if I was teaching a class on stem cells, I could get away with a lot. But I'm not sure what I could get away with here. There's some folks who really know. And they probably notice little things like those errors. A battle, all of these. One thing about this, Battle of Montesee was important. Battle at Fort Stevens is a little bit important because a guy named Lew Wallace was there and actually did a great job of defending that with very few people and was key to saving Washington. And of course, people know Lew Wallace is the man that wrote Ben-Hur, okay? But he also saved Washington, and we're going to move on from that. Early's operations against the B&O Railroad. We're going to touch this in a minute. Part of what Early was doing was trying to go up north and bust the B&O Railroad Bridge, an iron bridge that was up there, and that was a key thing in the invasion that got to Washington. If they could do that, they could get in the way of troop supply to Washington, and so on. Now we get back to our hero. In reaction to that, Grant sends the army before I talked about. They came out with the forces that overwhelmed Early, and they had this series of battles. Guard Hill, Shepherdstown, Opequon, 3rd Winchester, Fisher's Hill Towns, Brooks, Cedar Creek, and Waynesboro. A lot of them describe the same important ones. Really important ones are like Cedar Creek. Because at Cedar Creek, number one, 2 presidents were involved, Rutherford B. Hayes and McKinley, and probably others, but those 2 were involved in that. But the big thing about it was that pretty much tore Early's army up. It was over after that. And we'll go down through a piece of this. Custer is key to all of this. Here is a nice thing that's on the internet. The resolution is hard, but all of these little red blots you see here where these are going, well, it pretty much starts in the north, bang, 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 south, 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 south. Not the way you want the football to move if you're Early. He's losing all the time. Sometimes he's looking good, but he's losing all the time. Sheridan's campaign, what have I got here? That's pretty much a repetition of the same thing. It's interesting. I think what was interesting there is the dates. This is one way you can look at similar names if you get them by date. Like this one here, that's got another name. Smithfield Crossing, I think is Shepherdstown. And otherwise, they can be different. Early requested reinforcements, and he got them. Now Lee must have. Can you imagine how that goes? Lee's getting a request up here, and he's 2-to-1 down, and he's in the situation we saw, and he's getting requests, but he sends some. And he sends Kershaw and Lee, Fitzhugh, I think. And the Custer's group gets tangled up with them at Front Royal and pushes them back in different ways. And Custer had assistance coming in the situation, and artillery drove Custer off. But the end of the battle actually was different than my slide implies. The North won that battle, and that was a serious loss for the South as well. Battle of Shepherdstown. Here is Custer doing maneuver. Custer got pinned against. He got pinned against the river, and by remarkable maneuvering that the Confederates really appreciated, he got them back across the river and saved themselves. Some people say this is kind of Custer's 3rd Little Bighorn. Hanover Town, Trevilian Station, which we haven't talked about. I may not even get to that. That's funny. I should get to it. Trevilian Station, this guy, Shepherdstown, and of course, the Little Bighorn. Custer could dream up a good plan on his feet, and it often worked. At the Little Bighorn, Custer had problems because of subordinates, and Custer had bad luck at the river. Because when Custer came down on the river, couldn't get across that river, that might have worked. So what happened at Little Bighorn is Reno comes in like this, Custer's going around, and he's trying to cut him off like that. Gets down to the river, can't get across the river, and goes back up the hill, and then it's bad news. We get into that in detail in the other class. Smithfield Crossing, kind of dealt with that. bottom line of it is, Opequon, 3rd Winchester, Custer, once again, is this is very much a series of battles where cavalry is a key situation. They do have infantry working with them too. A la this war being different, they got caught up with several Confederate generals' wives. Now, where's Custer's wife through all of this? Are these girls just crazy? Didn't work out well for them, but probably didn't work out too bad because they weren't treated too bad, and that's a good thing because Custer's wife, Libby, was right there too. I mean, Custer would go out and he'd fight a battle during the day, and then he'd ride homeward and see Libby over at the next farmhouse. She was within 10, 20 miles lots of times.
I thought he did marry her after the war.
He married her after, he married her before the end of the war. But just where it is right now, it's not hitting me. And I think you'd be right this much, that at the start of this campaign, they're not married yet. But somewhere here pretty close, in Cedar Creek maybe, Custer gets wounded and goes home, and then we'll see. Let's watch and see. Wives of several Confederate generals fought and mentioned. Custer passed the fords. Merritt's cavalry met Averill's in the valley Pike. Players right going on right here are Merritt, who was a class ahead of Custer at West Point. Custer, on the other side, the Rosser, who's his friend, but on the other side, Ramseur is still here. Cavalry is a big piece of this. At Opequon, 3rd Winchester, another view of that battle. Don't quite understand where they're going here, but what's going on is certainly these are troop positions and where they're moving as they go up and down these roads along this railroad. And ease of transportation is a big part of every prediction of where they're going to have some sort of conflict. Battle of Fisher's Hill, directly thereafter, they push them back once again. We have the Battle of Fisher's Hill. This is what I find, this is the next best way to sketch this stuff out, and it's all over the internet until you get to that animated step. The worst way is a list of names. If you follow this in detail, it takes quite a bit of time. You can find out where the Union started off bunched up like this. We've got movement in this direction, and they're coming down in this way. And then, of course, the South retreats in this direction. Fisher's Hill is not. Ramseur is one guy I've talked about quite a bit. Ramseur is in this battle, but not killed here. Here's Crook. Crook's in this battle along with Custer. And, you know, Crook was also in the battle of Little Bighorn in the sense that he ran another thrust of the army. Three armies came at the Sioux with the Little Bighorn. Crook was leading one of them. Events of the battle. Sheridan had 3,000 men to oppose Early with 10,000. 30,000 to 10. 3 to 1. Don't like those odds, maybe. Early's right and left flanks were strongly anchored. By strongly anchored, it took me a while to get around this. Strongly anchored means I got a mountain here, I got a mountain here, and I'm in the middle. You can't get around me on a football field, right? Now suppose I got a mountain here and I got nothing here. I can get around you. That puts me coming at you from the end, and it's no great genius to figure out. It's quickly going to be a problem. Particularly, remember in the movie all that forest of muskets? They can't turn. Now they learn how to do this quick, but you're going to swing all these people and get them in position. Now, by the Spanish-American War, we start to see Maxim guns coming in. And by World War I, we got Brownings and we got other things. Well, we all seen them in the movie. Well, what are you looking at? By World War I got a water-cooled Browning. It sits here, there's a guy feeding it with a belt, there's a guy behind him going like that, right? One of those two guys alone will put out 460 bullets in a minute. The old industrial engineer says, well, with the musket 40 years before, it took, well, one guy could put out 3 bullets in a minute, so all I need say like I need 150 men to match those two. They don't get in the way of each other. They don't last long, but those two guys alone with that Maxim gun can put out as much lead as 150 men did in the Civil War. So they easily equal nearly two companies. That's 30 years later. Joe Wheeler fought this war, he fought that one too. All right, Crook, and we dealt that. And let's go back here. Earliest pushback to Waynesboro. All right. Well, he's pushed back to Waynesboro, but that's not the battle. Okay, Tom's book. This is a battle that's quite interesting, cavalry battle. It's like David and Goliath. The cavalry's here. Basically, Rosser is on one side, better position, I think, sometimes about the same number of troops. His buddy Custer's across the valley. You can see him. He says, well, look over there. That's that Custer. He's going to get a drubbing today like he never got in his life. Well, it didn't work out that way. Not at all. So Custer, to add to this, rides out in front of the troops, hat, golden hair, red sash going down here, and hollers out, like I said in first class, I believe, let's have a fair fight, boys. Now, do that on Guadalcanal, what's going to happen? It ain't going to be pretty. Worked here, but they did have a fair fight, more or less, and Rosser got his tail whipped. And Custer showed Custer's own special way of approaching things. There we go. And that's what the country saw. Now you think he's a showboat, but he's not only a showboat, he's also a genius, right along with Jeb Stuart. And when I was a young Navy officer coming off the farm, which is kind of like very practical, if you aren't working, what are you doing? I started to understand that the military is a lot about ceremony and a lot about people keeping people's heads going the way you want them to go. And that might not make sense on the surface. But it can be important to have that band playing and different things going on. Custer understood that. Custer, I'll get you to a break in a minute. Custer loved the theater. Custer loved to attend the theater. He did it every time he could. On the planes, he shows this because he will dress up in costumes and have other people dress up in costumes, and they do this playing. If he were to be here, he would be a member of the Bay City Players, probably. Now, that's not the Custer that they had in Little Big Man, but that was the Custer who really lived. He understood that if I can look like a hero and act like a hero in that very visual age, that's what his enemy gets to see, all 5,000 of them, and that's what his troops get to see. And they say, it's just like Sir Lancelot, man. Whoa, we're led by quite the guy. And us too. So they let him have it. Now, in this situation today, we don't operate that way for very good reasons. Battle of Cedar Creek. This is a good time for me to give you a break, okay?
Where was Custer when Jeb Stuart got killed?
He was right there. The guy that killed Jeb Stuart, as best they could figure, was a Michigan boy. He was a private. I think the name is well known, doesn't come to mind. He was dismounted at the time, and he takes his Colt pistol, and he's dismounted, aims at Jeb Stuart, kills him. It was that close. And of course it was a thing that you gotta watch out for. When you turn into the local hero, you're standing out. Bad news, don't do that. So they start to give you the extra special jobs and all kinds of. That's the things you should tell your boys and girls. Because when you're dealing with this stuff, and sometimes we have to, it'd be really nice if we didn't make like it was like Rambo. It wasn't, it never has been. And the men that fought it told you, but you didn't listen. I remember reading a book by a man named John Bill. John Bill fought in the Crusades. And it wasn't Sir Lancelot. It was like he talked about where he was fighting the Muslims on a bridge. And the end comment was a lot of good men died that day. So it strikes me that these vets tell the truth when they get to it. Sometimes they get carried away with the story, and that's okay. But it takes no amount of deep digging to get the picture of what this is like. And I've done some of this. I certainly wouldn't do some of this in the 6th grade class. But I sure wouldn't want a guy signing up or a girl signing up to go to the military to think they're joining the Navy to see the world. They're not joining the Navy to see the world. joining the Navy to do this if you have to. My guys in the Navy never quite caught on to that. And you know, it could come pretty quickly. Days of the battle, I promised Reagan, we will take one now. And I tell you, I'm having a great time.
We can tell.
Yeah, well, that's another thing. You know, yesterday I was out singing. I'm in this singing group. So this time yesterday I was down in Grand Lake at Abbey Park singing. And that's a little bit different than this.
I have read dozens of books on motorline campaigns. What's the best illustration I've seen of the movements of the troops?
Me too. And what it says is that's how to teach it. That guy that came up with that, I think a person could figure out how to do that more or less. And it'd be really good to do that. You can make things move like that on MapQuest and so on, but that's the right way to teach it. Tell them the better one.
Like I say, I read dozens of books on motorline campaigns, but this was the best illustration I've seen.
Well, that's good to hear that. I would have predicted it, and that's why I really wanted to show it. But you fall into that kind of thing when you're out there doing searches. I mean, you'll get 5 videos and 3 of them are basically a picnic, and then every once in a while this. But that'll make you understand the movement better.
Very good.
If I had young people go over that movie 3 or 4 times, they get a fair idea of what was going on. I just go nuts when I see this move here and move there. They can't make anything of it.
Very good.
That's one thing that's happening too. These movies are a lot better than old films.
Yeah, sure.
You know, because you can produce a movie now on your computer at home. So they're doing it a lot cheaper and there's a lot more of it.
It amazes me how anxious people are to put that information on for the public into it.
Well, it's like, for me, I put that stuff out all the time. It's kind of an interest, and us retirees do a lot of this. And oh yeah, I'm putting out stuff every day of my life. On lots of fields, like on weaponry, on biology, whatever I think might be interesting, and literally tens of hundreds of people in every town are. So yes, we are in a world that we want to talk a piece of history, what's happening with information from when I was a little kid in country school with this many books. Now is revolutionary. It is. Okay. I don't know.
He comes backwards over his cavalry.
I think it means like he's wheeling around the groups. He's maneuvering around this one, he's pulling this one back. But I can give you an answer that necessarily it's kind of what happened, but more. But he maneuvered his troops while the enemy was in front of him and still got those guys back in some way they could get back across the river. And I do think it might have been Chanteau.
With a safe zone, it was across the zone. So they had some kind of safe zone across the zone.
No, they were being attacked. People could see them, but they couldn't stop them. One thing about this is say like, now, if you're doing military in the Navy, now and for a long time before, and you're running this battle in your head, you don't see anything. I imagine the Army is a lot that way now too. So you keep some sort of a picture in your head about what's going on, and it's like things are happening over the horizon, you have no clue if they're even there. But you react to them in that way. And when I was a young officer, they gave me, they pulled the trick on me one night. It was very, very interesting. And told me how much this could be unreal. And that was that they had, in order to do this, you have to have a destroyer. And you have to have motivated young guys on the destroyer that are completely in on the trip. what the trick is, you get a junior officer, and he's the guy that's kind of the fall guy in all this. And it was called a purple rabbit exercise. So what happens, and all the folks gotta be in on it except the guy that's the victim. What they did is they ran a complete exercise with ships on the horizon, over the horizon, contacts over the horizon, submarines down below, sonar contacts, radio contacts, a complete picture that is just nothing. It's just information on the script that came to you as the junior officer, and you're reacting to this in a certain way, and you think this is the real world. Well, the takeaway from that is if you were in a real conflict, most of what you'd be hearing is nothing but information. Is that 10 tanks over there? Is that somebody's damn wild imagination? You can't know. Now here, these guys looking over there can know, and certainly we have people that could know, but a lot of this stuff would be a mental picture. And by the time it's over, you never saw anything until it was over. I'll bet you that's going on. Yeah, they could do that. I happened to be on the bridge when this went down, but you could do it anywhere. I mean, because as a person evaluating this, you're taking on faith what this person's telling you is true. Don't have to be true.
So that person feeding information, supposedly got it
From the censors, but he didn't really. He got it from the script. And they're all playing this thing. They know what it's like, so they're all working this way. One of the best experiences I ever had, because it taught me that what you think is real might not be real at all.
So what did the captain do?
The captain's in on it. It's a valuable experience as far as I'm concerned. It didn't hurt anything. We steamed ahead, and you had no way that you could go ahead and fire guns and so on. Anyway, moving along, let's see where we are time-wise. This is a good example of what you can pick up in a minute. The Battle of Cedar Creek was concluded by cavalry. And this is a picture of what that could look like, and yet you couldn't, with a static picture, get the real picture, but that was a good try, and they were learning how to show those pictures. And Sheridan's right. At the Battle of Cedar Creek, Sheridan was 30 miles away. What happened at Cedar Creek was that the Confederates always trying to make hay with a brilliant attack, wonderfly executed, rescuing them from a situation that toe-to-toe they're just going to, it's not going to work at all. So Early does this again and again, and again it doesn't quite work for him. At Cedar Creek, early in the morning, the Confederates attack the line, throw it back, throw the Union back in complete disarray. Some people flee nearly from the field, and then things start to get rescued and so on, and they go back and forth in some sort of a battle. One of the key rescue points is when this little guy right here, Bill Sheridan, arrives from Winchester, which is 30 miles away. Now, if you were a kid in the 1890s, you would have heard about Sheridan's ride all the time, because it's like the ride of Paul Revere. And if we got this here, I have this, I'll read it really quickly. Up from the south at break of day, ringing to Winchester's fresh dismay, the affrighted air with shudder bore, like a herald in haste to the chieftain's door. A terrible grumble and rumble and roar, telling the battle was on once more. And Sheridan 20 miles away, and wider still those bellows of war, thundering along the horizon's bar, and louder yet into Winchester rolled the roar of that Red Sea uncontrolled, making the blood of the listener cold, as he thought of the stake in that fiery fray, and Sheridan 20 miles away. Is a good broad highway leading down there, through the flush of the morning light. A steed as black as the steeds of night was seen to pass as an eagle in flight, as if he knew the terrible need. He stretched away with his utmost speed, hills rose and fell, but his heart was gay with Sheridan 15 miles away. Still sprung from those swift hoofs thundering south, the dust like smoke from the cannon's mouth. the trail of a comet sweeping faster and faster, foreboding to traitors and the doom of disaster. The hardened seed and the hardened master were beating by prisoners assaulting their walls, impatient to be where the battlefield calls. Every nerve in the charger was strained to full play, with Sheridan only 10 miles away. Under his burning feet, the road, like an airway alpine river, flowed. The landscape sped away behind, like an ocean flying before the wind, and the steed, like a bark fed with a furnace ire, swept on with his wild eyes full of fire. But lo, he is nearing his heart's desire. He is snuffing the smoke of the roaring fray, with Sheridan only 5 miles away. The first that the general saw were the groups of stragglers, and then the retreating troops. What is done? What to do? A glance told him both. Then striking his spurs with a horrible oath, he dashed down the line amid a storm of huzzas. The wave of retreat checked its course there, because the sight of the master compelled it to pause. With foam and with dust, the black charger was gray. By the flash of his eye and the red nostrils clay, he seemed to the whole great army to say, "I brought you, General. You Sheridan all the way, from Winchester down to save the day. Hurrah, hurrah for Sheridan, hurrah for horse and man." And when their statues are placed on high under the dome of the Union sky, the American soldiers' temple of fame, there with the glorious general's name, be it said in letters both bold and bright, "Here's the steed that saved the day by carrying Sheridan into the fight from Winchester 20 miles away." That would have been a good thing to talk about, particularly later, but it was that day that Sheridan rescued the day at Cedar Creek. This is what the battlefield looks like at Cedar Creek, typical of Shenandoah, beautiful country. It's interesting how those knolls played such a part in it. After Cedar Creek, Early's pretty well finished, but he retreats to Waynesboro, and what happens with that is that Custer finds Tom Ross burning the bridge. Yet once again, Custer encountered Early's full force at Waynesboro. They don't have enough troops, so Custer simply rolls up the line and destroys it. After that, Early's finished. Pretty well finished before it, and that puts us down to Appomattox campaign, which is not bad. Now, things going on here that's interesting. It's part of Army politics, and really, at Cedar Creek. I want to go back to talk about Custer and his wife, Custer and Andy's wife. I missed things that I wanted to get. Here's little Libby, beautiful little girl, a little average young woman, pretty, about 20. She's meeting President Lincoln. She is also going to the War Department when her husband comes in with all these battle flags from Cedar Creek. And it's a sight from the movie. And they promoted Custer right there to Major General, Brevet. So they made a ceremony out of it. His troops come in behind him and say how important he was to it. It's like Errol Flynn was there in sight of everybody, only it's real. That's happened before this. But the politics carries on, and Sheridan does not want to go where his boss wants him to go. His boss wants him to go down there and join Sherman down in Atlanta way. They're further up north than that. But what Sheridan wants to be is he wants to be back here at Petersburg because he knows the war's getting over. So what he does back up here in the Shenandoah is he simply lights out on those horses. They rode day after day after day, plodded across all that mile, mud, rain, and crap, and got themselves to Petersburg. He shows up with Grant. Grant's not quite sure he's happy with him, but okay, you're here, you might as well do something. And then we start the business of the Appomattox campaign, which is short in duration, and of course I'm where I always am. Short in duration, but intense and horrific. It would be easier on the northern side. On the southern side, it must have been horrific. And really, to write this same class from the southern point of view would be really interesting. What's happened, of course, is Richmond's surrounded. There are 16-year-old boys that are barefoot in the trenches in Richmond. It's a lot like Germany in World War II. Everybody that can carry a gun out there, kind of. Supplies are coming in because they're not completely surrounded. Supplies are coming in on the South Side Railroad, probably down in here more, and getting up through Petersburg into Richmond. Grant, for reasons I don't understand yet, can't completely surround this group. So he keeps edging his troops around. That's my concept right now, till I know better. Comes in, they build trenches, a lot like World War I, but also a lot like Yorktown, because the scale is small. There's 50 miles of trenches around Richmond in 1865. There are several layers deep. There's forts, there's ways to sally ports, there's sighted cannon in different directions. It's a sophisticated military work. Now, why do I say it's strange? Because I don't understand, but I know I don't. It's 1865, 50 years later than that, 65, yeah. 50 years later than that, it's 1915, and across Europe is a 1,400-mile-long trench system that nobody can get through. It's World War I. We got a lot more players on the board. And what you're seeing here, when you watched all this stuff happen, and how do you get around in a Civil War army? You rotate around the end, or you charge through the middle. But by 1914, 15, you got that guy with that Maxim gun. He's a key player. So you can't mash the troops and put them in front of that guy. It's just murder, like they say. But they tried it, and we all know about it. We've seen it in the movies, and how it worked out. And it worked out not so well. They killed a couple 100,000 people at the Battle of the Somme in 2 weeks. That's a third as many people as died in the whole Civil War in 2 weeks. But you can't get around that 1,400-mile long line. That's the thing to say, okay, what changed and why didn't they understand it and what could they do about it? Well, what they did about it at the end of the First World War, they invented the tank. But okay, now back to where we are. Grant is pushing these guys to where they're starting to starve. Grant sends people down to the south in the short run to cut off that final supply line. There is Navy activity going on all the time. They still are supplied from Wilmington, North Carolina, I believe. If that supply lines are cut off, it gets to where the city starves and the Army starves, and that won't work. So it's starting. They send Pickett down here to this southern area to kind of defend against actions that Grant's sending down here to cut off these final things. That results in battles such as what we had at Dinwiddie Courthouse, Five Forks, and after Dinwiddie Courthouse and actions up here closer to the railroad, we know the railroad's done. Lee says to Davis, it's over. They can't defend you anymore. The Army's got to move. Now, I got thinking about it in the middle of the night there sometime, thinking about, okay, I always kind of visualize this as, okay, they're in Petersburg, and the lines go all the way around Richmond, and it's really difficult to get in and out. But I don't think so. I think that Grant would have loved to see Lee's army leave Richmond so he could catch them in the open and beat him more. Because ultimately, he did catch them in the open, and it didn't last, right? So Lee takes off, and what they do is they talk about what happened with Lee. Southern bureaucracy wasn't terribly effective, but I have no way to even conceive what they were dealing with by this point. I mean, it's a horrible mess. Nothing's working. Lee's taken off with a few thousand men, and he's going off this way trying to join Johnson in North Carolina. He's got a long bridge, a high bridge over here that he's got to get across. High bridge right there that's really critical that they have to keep open in order to have this plan work. So he sneaks out. He gets out of Richmond. And that's another way he did it. But it does demonstrate one thing. Here's what the Union's doing in blue. Here's what Lee's doing. Here's the famous wagon trains going on again. Supplies, not near enough supplies. Here's people coming from all over Richmond area trying to get together to form the Army going out. They come from different directions, form up here at Amelia Courthouse, I guess. Meantime, Custer moving out, Custer and all the cavalry moving out, trying to get ahead of them, and the Army follow along with it. Dinwiddie Courthouse. want to talk here not so much about the battle, but about Pickett. We all know about Pickett's charge. Pickett was born, he died, he was 40 years old, 65. He was born in 1825. He's 40 years old here. But Pickett is a thing that we should know in our studies, and the kids would never think about. And that is, you got a 40-year-old man, and it's 1865, he's already got problems. He's got heart problems. He's got the beginning of heart disease. He's going to die from heart disease at 50. Okay? His reputation's been pretty badly damaged thanks to Pickett's charge. He also has piles, which is not good in general. He has gastrointestinitis, which I haven't even looked up. The key to it is if you want to do a three-dimensional study of history, you better not make these people that live this life into mannequins. They're not tokens in a game piece. They're people with strange things like each of us. Which means lots of these guys are fighting sick. Now, I've had my heart attack, okay? One thing good about having a heart attack is it teaches you that heart changes everything. And how you are going to react, how you have heart problems while you're busy fighting a war, I'm not sure of. But it couldn't have been exciting. Another guy that had problems unknown to me was Robert E. Lee had some problems with something in 1863. I have not seen that, but it's mentioned, and we picked that up. Lee was an older man by their standards and a young man by the standards of the people in here. We all know him, right? His hair is as white as mine in the pictures. Your eyes travelers and say, how you doing, old man? You know, not so much how you doing as they really respected him. Well, Lee, the old man, was about 53. So that puts him way under most of this group, okay? But he's 53. Lee, I think, was born the same year as Lincoln, who was also right there. I think he was born in 1809, which means in the Civil War, this guy is like 53. He dies in 70. So he's dead long before he's my age. Lee lived to be 61, unless my numbers are wrong, and I think they're pretty close. So this was another effect you've got. These people, when I make my simulation, I got to put people with real tendencies in it. Pickett screwed up all the way through this campaign, but Pickett was not a well man. Pickett was in the bottom part of his class to begin with. He wasn't terribly bright, but people really liked him. Longstreet promoted him all the time, but by this time, he's not up to speed at all.
Isn't he really almost dehumanized by his failure at Pickett's charge and the loss of all of his men?
I don't know. I think that is something that, I think that that's a story that you'd find true. I mean, what's it like when you lead, you're 37, he's really the age, he's younger than one of my children, and he's the same age as my two girls, pretty much. So to me at this age, which makes me flawed observer, I still kind of look at him as a kid. That gets in my way, because I feel sorry for him in a way. He goes across that, he does what his boss says, he comes back across, and 15,000 feet of his people are laying out there in the field. And this happened like within minutes. I mean, what's it like? I don't know. I can guess. But yeah, I think that probably wrecked itself and probably wrecked some other things going on. I don't see how it couldn't be related. Description of Dinwiddie, well, we're short on time, I don't want to get to other stuff. We talked about this. Five Forks is where different roads came together. It was critical to the supply. They do have, I think, at Five Forks, the location, Dinwiddie Courthouse down here. We're starting to move west. Here's Five Forks. I think the South Side Railroad, can't quite locate it. I think it's going to go down south, and South Side Railroad running like this, going to Lynchburg. Key to supply of Richmond. Also key to get out of there. This picture I like, and I wish it was better resolution. I recommend you look it up, because I think it tells you what those men would have felt like, thought like, and you don't want to get in their way. Because there's something I know, and I don't know if the other guys know, and I don't know if the girls know it, but there's something about men that kind of tie together in a pack. And when they do, they fit well with wolves, and this is kind of what you're looking at here. These guys jump 12 feet in the air and claw your eyes out. And that's what this artist is talking about. If you don't think people can get that way, you're wrong. They lose their sense of self. They become part of a bigger thing, and then they go with it. And I think that we were capable of doing that with our friends, the wolves who turned into dogs. That's another story, but I think you see that right there. You aren't stopping this group. They've got that determination. They're not they're just trained to the max. They're as good as they'll ever be, and it's just not going to be something you want to be in front of. And this fellow right here with flag, that's Sheridan. I think you also want to remember this when you're thinking about why they might have disrespected the Plains Indians, because they didn't do that.
Back when Sheridan went to Petersburg instead of going to meet up with Sherman, did he get in trouble for that?
No. No.
Was it an order or just?
I'm not so sure it was so much, I'm not sure. I think it was more like a design intent. It's a lot like what we know that those of us who were in the service, you can get away with anything if your boss lets you do it. It's right. I used to say in GM, you can do anything so long as it's right. Well, this is working out all right. Custer did a lot of that sort of thing and still survived things that other guys would be wrecked over. You know, Custer got court-martialed out on the plains, and because he was, once again, his wife was in very bad shape, she was sick. He marched his people hundreds of miles to get to that fort, completely out of orders, and they court-martialed him and threw him out of the service for a year. Now, for most mortals, that means you're done. You can join the parade in Monroe, but you're done. You're not coming back to the service. But Sheridan was on his side and understood his abilities. Sheridan brings him back in. If Sheridan hadn't brought him back in there, then no Custer's last man. He'd been a businessman in Monroe, maybe New York. You can do anything so long as you can get away with it. Description of Five Forks, okay. Yeah, Lee wrote hold Five Forks at all costs because it's essential. Five Forks didn't hold, and therefore Lee had to evacuate. There's a battle at Sailor's Creek. Nearly 1/4 of the retreating Confederate Army was cut off by Sheridan elements of the 2nd, 4th, and 6th Corps. Artillery drove the Confederate back. The counterattack Union cavalry cut through the right of the Confederate lines. Most Confederates surrendered. This was the end of the war for Ewell, Lee, should have told you which Lee, Kershaw, and others. Generals quit. They quit, they were captured, it was over. And what that leads to, this is the 6th of April. That's some more Sailor's Creek, showing its location. Here was Five Forks. We moved some. Now they're catching it this way. They are heading towards this High Bridge business up here, trying to get across High Bridge. And one of the saddest stories that I know of about this whole affair that happens all the time. Here we talk about Appomattox Courthouse. But what happened to that after Sailor's Creek and after other conflicts going on, one of which I want to relate now. Somehow, we all know about this High Bridge. You can see pictures of it. I should have one, don't. If the Union can destroy that High Bridge, they've captured Lee. They want to get there. Cavalry, they sent about 100 cavalrymen, maybe some others, to that bridge to destroy the bridge, but they found the Confederate cavalry there first, and lots of them. They didn't have any people, but right there on site, they were the majority. So the captain of the folks from the Union says, we're going to work it this way. I got this one unit of cavalry. They're going to charge like heck, and then you guys in the infantry, or you've got to get up right now and charge with us, or we're done. Well, the cavalry charged, the infantry hesitated, and they were killed to a man. What's really sad about that is the war's over in 2 days. That's sad, because it really didn't do anything. It didn't do anything because Lee controlled the bridge. They didn't control the bridge. Now, if you were looking at this and the picture was better, you'd see Mr. Custer, who's probably Yeah, it is. This guy right here. Custer's in the room when they sign off the declaration. And, see this table? The table ended up at Custer's house. Custer got the surrender table, one of these two. It kind of looks like they signed on two different tables. Custer got the table that Grant signed the surrender documents on. Did they like Custer? Yeah, they sure did. This is the table. Grant's table is the Smithsonian Institute. You could go see it today. It was taken by General Sheridan, who offered $20, and McLean refused it, which was probably smart, but Sheridan wasn't going to play with that. So he just left the money and took it. The table was taken, and money was thrown on the floor, the table was sent to Mrs. Custer. And loaned to the Smithsonian in 1912, title of the table, she gave it permanently. This is the table. This chair, I believe, is the one that Lee sat in. Okay? Sheridan said when he gave her the table, that he said, your gallant husband has done as much to forward the successful prosecution of this war of any man alive. Paraphrased, but that's pretty much it. Sheridan really regarded Custer highly. So my point in all of this, and my point in the class when we started it, was to right what I thought was an injustice perpetrated on us by my generation. Custer was anything but a fool. Custer had a great deal of thanks coming to him for what he did during the Civil War. To leave a story about that man that was what it was, like he's a fool, he persecuted Indians, and he did lots of other things, it's just a falsehood that really isn't fair. And that does bother me in a way. Did he make a mistake? Yeah, I'd say he made a mistake. But he did quite well for us anyway. Total casualties of the Civil War, some of these you'll know. Total troops, Union, 15.5 million. Confederate, higher number than I often see, million. Wounded, 275,000, 194,000. Died of wounds, 110, 194. Died of disease, 250,000 men. Less than 250,000 men. These numbers are interesting. The ratio kind of like, this is basically, in the Union side, it's kind of looking like one guy died of battle wounds or things, and 2.5 of them died from disease problems. Over here looks a little better, like 1.6. That's another whole study. What's going on in the medical world in the Civil War is just remarkable. Those two little hard numbers right there need to A, be verified, and B, if they are, why? Why did the South do so much better? They're the ones that are starving, and they're the ones that don't have the shoes, and they're the ones that don't have food, I mentioned before. So one thing leads to another in questions. And those questions remain valid. Where the answers don't, the questions can remain valid. You learn out of this, you learn the supply of the troops is essential. I said at the start of this course that young generals study tactics and old generals study logistics. That's not my quote, that's from an old general. I think he's probably got a point. Custer after the war. Some quick things that we'll go over in the next class. If some of you, like I mentioned, I signed on to try to get that done in the summertime. I want to talk a little bit about the campaign trail. On the campaign trail for President Johnson, Grant, Farragut went with him, and they did a kind of a circle trip around the country trying to promote Johnson's Reconstruction program so that Johnson would get reelected. This was really unpopular. I mean, this was, so Custer's foray into politics right after the war was a large mistake. And that's the thing we can talk about. Also, I need to talk about Reconstruction and mention a thought that I hope you don't leave, because I think it's something that I am very interested in. Have you thought about the world of 1870, 75? The world, the United States. In the United States, about 1875, you got the whole South under Reconstruction and a heck of a problem with race relations, right? West of the Mississippi, you got the whole place in an uproar with things like Custer's going to deal with out there. you only got maybe a third of the country that isn't under serious problems based on interfaces with other folks. And when you look at what Grant must be thinking about in those times, every time he thinks about what he should be doing on the plains, he's also got to be thinking about what he should be doing in the South, where problems could come in a minute. Reconstruction's been failing. We would get rid of Reconstruction by a backroom political deal to get a Republican elected in 1876. And the rights of people in the South were utterly trampled upon. They did things in the South. I watched a movie on Reconstruction, says this is important, and I didn't know it. In the South, they did things like pass laws that a black man couldn't work at anything but farming. Those of you who are conservatives on this issue, we have in the Constitution the right to bear arms, but not if you're black in the South. They passed laws that a black man could not have a gun in states in the South. Now, reasons why, because people in the Ku Klux Klan had guns and they really didn't want any competition. It's more dangerous if this guy's, why, he might lose his head and blow your brains out. If he hasn't got a gun, that won't be a problem, okay? Lots of things there. Custer in the Plains years is quite a romantic story. Washita is a short word for one of Custer's Indian battles. Little Bighorn is known to all of us. Custer participated in all of that on the plains, but I want to talk to him about Libby and George just a second. There's your answer. February 9th, 1864. He was in civilian clothes, as I recall. She looked beautiful. There's pictures of her. They had a wonderful, unorthodox relationship. Custer was probably not faithful, but he was, like I said, in the first class or the second. Custer was a lot like maybe Mr. Clinton. They were a couple. They were going to be a couple forever, and they all understood that he might just go off and get himself involved with some Indian meeting. He might, like Mona Sita. Custer had lots of adventures. One with Annie Jones, who came back in the Shenandoah, and he was told by his boss that she must never visit the Army again. This is going on. Molly Hollins, from his early days, I've seen kiss that crimson tip. Custer was a romantic type of guy in every sense of the way. Custer married Mona in a Cheyenne ceremony. Now there's a thing from a movie, and for the second class. Mona Sita was a Cheyenne girl, and probably a very pretty Cheyenne girl. It was one of the captives that Custer had, I believe. He married her and was made, I think, a member of the 12th. But meantime, he's married to Libby. Tom Custer, Libby were just really, really close. Custer family was very, very close, and Custer took care of his family by buying farms and doing different things. Custer was an animal lover. He always had dogs after the Peninsula campaign. Here's another picture. Custer loved pictures. More pictures of Custer than almost anybody in that time frame. Here's Custer in the world of the West. Here's his dogs. Here's his Indian friends and probably a scout. And here is his old partner that tells him what to do a lot. That's right, Libby, living on the plains. Now I'm telling you one thing about Libby. She was a good friend for hard times, because there's a lot of girls who wouldn't have gone along with us living on the plains, but she did. She could live in Washington and survive. She could live on the dogs surround me. Well, and he's talking about him and his relationship to his dog. He might have killed during the buffalo hunt. So Custer was he was a person with lots of feelings. His view about the folks that he killed in combat was strange in view of that, but he had it. He was basically a knight in shining armor, and it was game in a way. But his vision, his face, as you look at him in those times, doesn't look that way. And there's Custer when he was busy buying farms for his family members. Custer, downsides of Mr. Custer to look for. Nepotism. His family got lots of money around the Army. His family got positions around the Army. Another thing you look at with Mr. Custer is probably, was he a martinet? because his bosses all loved him, but some people thought that basically he'd do whatever the boss told him. And this business with McClellan is interesting because it's not Custer's personality to like to hold off, and yet McClellan was a joke and a half in lots of ways. Again and again, McClellan would have twice the men that Lee had. I don't imagine Lee respected McClellan. I can't imagine he did. Certainly he had great abilities in some way. As a leader of a mass army, he did not. This is an example of him and his business of showmanship. Actually, known by Buffalo Bill. Buffalo Bill went out on the plains and killed an Indian. I told you that story earlier, when our man Custer was killed. Custer was a writer. On the second course, I'll try to get into these and have them all known. These fellows, both Libby and Custer, were good writers. They wrote Boots and Salads, Follow the Guidon, Tending on the Plains, The Boy General. Others were written for magazines. They entered that world of public culture and entertainment. And that's what he liked to do. Custer, after Little Bighorn, planned to go on the lecture circuit. And one of the reasons he wanted an adventure probably was for the lecture circuit. Libby Custer, Angel of Charity. After the war and after his death, she was a paragon of support. She became a respected New York Society person. She was involved with the Women's Hospital and secretary of the Society of Decorative Arts. Can you imagine the world she lived in? Her story would be interesting to write. Some lady would be better to write that, do a history study on Libby Custer. She would have been really seeing all the players right then. Member of Bellevue Hospital, board member, Hospital of Nursing, because they loved New York and they went to New York. And of course, Lyman Custer, the myth. And about getting there, more for me to know about it, but basically Custer has turned into our Achilles. Custer has turned into our Samson. The fact we talk about Custer is amazing. How many other Civil War generals can you name? There were dozens of them. We know Custer. We tell his story and then we rework his story to be what's useful to us again. And that's what certainly has happened. But there was a real man out there who did real things, and it was quite phenomenal. But this Custer's alive and well in the 6th grade class, and alive and well in all of our minds in various ways. And so the purpose of this is to bring him back to ground and tell a true story about what was going on in his life in a better way than we had, even though in 4 short times we couldn't possibly do all of that. And with that, I'll conclude the class, and I want to thank you all very much for attending and giving me this opportunity. I'm going to miss this, I'll tell you. And if you haven't filled out an evaluation, I'd appreciate it. They like to get those things. That's useful in places. Yes. And I never played Gary Owen because I found out they never used Gary Owen until he was on the plains in 1867. Well, if they're talking on the plains, they're right, but if they're talking the Civil War, they're too early.